The Politics of Language in Canada. This is the topic of a book authored in 1988 by Jock Andrew, a veteran of the Royal Canadian Navy. The book is entitled Enough! Wake Up, English-Speaking Canada! Enough of this absurdity! While the book is highly critical of certain Francophone politicians and church leaders, it is crucial to understand that it does not criticize Canadian Francophones as a whole. As we all know, there are millions of wonderful Francophone Canadians who bear no responsibility for the nefarious political machinations of Pierre Trudeau, his cabinet, and other Francophone leaders. To be clear, this book criticizes not Canada's Francophones as a whole, but certain Francophone leaders, and it criticizes many Anglophones too. As an introduction, here's what's printed on the back cover of Jock Andrew's first book, Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, which was published in 1977. Jock Andrew graduated from the Royal Canadian Naval College in 1948 and served until 1974. The last 8 years of his service were spent in Ottawa. The revolutionary changes he witnessed during those years impelled him to write this book. Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow pursues the implementation of Canada's Official Languages Act to its logical conclusion, the colonization of Canada's 9 English-speaking provinces and of the national capital by French-speaking Canadians. Quote, "The primary and sole objective since Mr. Trudeau came to power has been to convert Canada to a French-speaking nation. That objective will remain until every city, town, and village in Canada has become French-speaking and French-controlled. The strategy is based on one fact. Many French Canadians can speak English, but very few English-speaking Canadians can speak French. The way is obvious. Simply make each and every government job available only to those who can speak both languages." Since Mr. Trudeau came to power, the federal government has been sending agitators, paid by the Secretary of State's Department, into every Canadian community outside Quebec in which there are any French Canadians at all, regardless of how few. The purpose is to have the French-Canadian element demand that every service which is provided by the provincial, county, and municipal governments be provided in the French language. They are told to demand that all policemen, bus drivers, telephone operators, hospital workers, provincial and municipal government workers be French-speaking. They are organized into pressure groups to demand that stores, banks, and business owners hire only French-speaking clerks, personnel managers, and managers. One at a time, the provinces are crumbling. And now, here are some extensive excerpts from Jock Andrew's 1988 book, Enough. For more than 20 years, we have watched as English-speaking Canadians and the English language have been systematically and quietly replaced by French Canadians and the French language in our Canadian federal government and in every agency of that government. Until now, that transition from English to French has been brought about by the Official Languages Act, combined with thousands of secret federal cabinet directives. But now, in 1988, we are witnessing the last mechanisms being put into place for the overt and unrestrained final transition of the whole of Canada into a French-speaking nation. There are 3 mechanisms, and they are: 1. Bill C-72, a complete rewrite of the Official Languages Act. While Bill C-72 purports to uphold English as well as French in Canada, what the bill actually achieves is as follows. Bill C-72 gives the federal cabinet, the Secretary of State, and the Commissioner for Official Languages unlimited powers and resources to bring about the complete Frenchification of the Canadian Government Public Service, the Canadian Armed Forces, all government agencies and commissions, the courts, and all Crown corporations. The same bill provides the resources and directions and specifies the intent to help bring about the Frenchification of all of our provincial and municipal governments, all provincial and municipal government services, all labor organizations, all voluntary organizations, the Canadian business community, and our schools. Bill C-72 also means the compulsory Frenchification of all private corporations which do any business either directly or indirectly with the federal government or with Crown corporations. In all Canadian government institutions, both across the whole of Canada and outside of Canada, not only will all employees be facilitated and encouraged, and indeed in many cases directed to work in the French language, but all supervisors and managers must be French-speaking. Second, the Meech Lake Accord. This agreement ratifies, on behalf of the federal government and the other provinces, the outlawing of the English language, which was brought about by Bill 101 in the province of Quebec. This accord also recognizes Quebec as an inviolable French-speaking state within the soon-to-be French-speaking nation of the whole of Canada. As the result of this agreement, the English language and the non-Francophone minorities in Quebec, 20% of its population, have been given the final killing blow by the Mulroney Conservative government and by the provincial premiers of English-speaking Canada. In the brief interval since the accord was passed, Premier Bourassa and his Quebec language police have literally been terrorizing the remaining English-speaking minority in Quebec. These people are screaming out to the rest of Canada that they are in fear for their very existence, and the news media across Canada is paying no attention whatsoever. These same people are crying out to us that with the passing of Bill C-72, we across the rest of Canada are next, and no one is listening. Their disgust with the apathy and stupidity of the rest of English-speaking Canada cannot be measured. Third, Ontario's French Language Services Act and its soon-to-be enacted equivalents in our other provinces. This act makes the provincial governments nothing more or less than huge machines whose entire resources have now been brought to bear on one goal, the Frenchification of the provincial governments and all their services. The Act permits the Frenchification of all regional and municipal governments and municipal services and requires the Frenchification of all privately or publicly owned agencies and businesses which do business with the provinces or which receive any form of funding either directly or indirectly from the provinces. To meet these legislated requirements for French-speaking language services in both the public and private sectors of our provinces, hundreds of thousands of Francophones from Quebec and from outside Canada are already being recruited and will continue to be recruited into our 8 remaining English-speaking provinces to fill the French language jobs thus artificially created. The French Language Services Act means that hundreds of thousands of heretofore English language jobs in what was English-speaking Canada will now go to Francophones only. You and your children and grandchildren will soon have lost those jobs forever. What is so preposterous about what is being done to our country is this. Of those Canadians who live outside the province of Quebec, 96 to 97% of us are not French-speaking at all, but are English-speaking either by choice or by birth. Those 96% of us who are English-speaking in 9 of our 10 provinces have absolutely nothing to gain by this legislated Frenchification of this nation. The French language is both redundant and unnecessary. Its adoption at astronomical cost serves only one purpose, the scheduled Frenchification of this entire country and the imminent elimination of English-speaking Canada. In Ottawa today, the remaining English-speaking civil servants and members of the military are afraid to speak up against what they see happening for fear of losing their jobs. They are afraid to attend protest meetings for fear of being videotaped, and believe me, I've seen it happen. They know that the moment they leave their jobs or retire, their jobs will go to French Canadians, all of them. The same is now true in Toronto and throughout Ontario, where the remaining English-speaking provincial government civil servants now fear for their jobs and where they have given up hope for promotion. Toronto, Hamilton, and Mississauga, with Francophone populations of less than 1%, are officially targeted right now by the Ontario government for Frenchification. All stores, businesses, hospitals, police, everything, just as fast as Francophones can be found to fill the jobs. Even before the English-speaking government employees can be moved out, French Canadians are being moved in and paid full-time under the device known as Franco Banks in our federal government. Exactly the same thing is scheduled to happen in the 8 other English-speaking provinces, New Brunswick having already been processed. Today, if you are a federal public servant in Ottawa and don't reply in acceptable French when addressed in French by a French Canadian who probably speaks English, you can be in deep trouble. To anyone who has worked in our Canadian government, or government-owned corporations, or the military, or the RCMP during these last 15 years, it is as plain as the nose on your face that Canada's government and its various entities are in transition from the English language to the French language. Do you wonder why? Take a look at these excerpts from a speech made by Trudeau's last Secretary of State. The speech was made in French to the Acadian Association of Nova Scotia on November 13, 1982. This association is funded to the amount of $500,000 per year by you, the Canadian taxpayer. A copy of the speech, which was not printed in any English newspaper, was sent to me by one of the few members of Canada's Parliament who had any inkling of what was happening in Canada or cared. The relevant excerpts from Mr. Joyal's speech are as follows. My role as Secretary of State of Canada is first and foremost to ensure that my French compatriots in Canada feel with deep conviction, as I do, that this is their country and it reflects their image. You know, the idea, the challenge, the ambition of making Canada a French country, both inside and outside Quebec, an idea some people consider a bit crazy, is something a little beyond the ordinary imagination. The difficulties that arose between the Fédération des Francophones, or Quebec, and the State Department belong to the past. The Canada of minorities is the Canada of tomorrow. As hard as it was in the 70s for some of our fellow Canadians who speak the other language to accept the fact that Canada is a French state, we must avoid all politicizing the issue. The greatest risk that Francophone associations take and will take for French status in Canada is politicizing the debate in a partisan manner. We have to find ways to shelter ourselves from changes in government. In that speech, which Mr. Joyal repeated sometime later in Manitoba, to the outright horror of English-speaking Manitobans, Mr. Joyal, as Canada's Secretary of State, finally enunciated what most of English-speaking Canada had refused to believe, that the singular goal of the Trudeau government and of French Canada as a whole since Trudeau came to power in 1968 has been to make Canada a unilingual French-speaking nation from coast to coast. The question now arises, why did so much of English-speaking Canada refuse to believe what was going on in Canada, particularly after I had spelled out in detail the step-by-step process of the French takeover in my 1977 book Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, that fortuitously received wide circulation throughout the country? What is entirely unbelievable about Canada and Canadians is that even when one of Trudeau's chief lieutenants, in the person of the Secretary of State, openly babbled the best-kept secret in the history of North America, Canadians have been so reduced to the status of sheep that no one paid the least bit of attention to him. And what is even more remarkable about Canada is that even now, with Trudeau out of the picture, all three of the mainstream political parties of Canada are still promising French Canadians to carry on the work that Trudeau began to make Canada a French-speaking nation from coast to coast. If that sounds like an exaggeration, it is not. Under Mulroney and his Conservatives, the work of the Commissioner of Official Languages toward the Frenchification of the whole of Canada goes on, and it is in fact being accelerated. The huge sums of money, measured in millions of dollars from the federal government and the government of Quebec to each of the various Francophone associations in our 9 predominantly English-speaking provinces for the Frenchification of those provinces are, if anything, being increased. Mr. Broadbent, in his quest for votes, has stated that he agrees with these policies and, if elected, will pursue them actively. The whole ghastly picture is not only a little beyond the ordinary imagination, but totally absurd. On the one hand, we have Quebec, which is now totally French, despite a still sizable English-speaking population, and will forever remain so, committed to the total extermination of the English language, not only in Quebec, but in the rest of Canada. On the other hand, excluding New Brunswick with its 33% Francophones, we have 8 provinces whose Francophone populations run from 1% to less than 5%, busting themselves to accommodate a militant and avaricious minority which is sworn by secret oath to the extermination of English Canada and the English language, province by province, territory by territory, and municipality by municipality. 15 years ago, during Trudeau's reign, the Canadian ambassador to France stood before the French National Assembly and told them that Canada was going to become a French nation. He knew whereof he spoke, because he, like every other French-Canadian politician in this country, every French-Canadian priest and bishop, most of our French-Canadian Armed Forces officers, and most other French-Canadians across Canada who have the grey matter to be trusted have been sworn to the same oath. I have yet to come to the most frightening happening of all in 20 years of this continuing nightmare, but first I want to relate what I have said about there being an oath for the overthrow and elimination of English-speaking Canada. In 1961, after 4 years in Ottawa, I was sent to Victoria as the engineer officer of the destroyer HMCS Fraser. At that time, the Commission for Biculturalism and Bilingualism under Pearson and Pelletier was in full swing, and everyone was doing his and her best to believe all the baloney about bilingualism being necessary for Canadian unity. On the West Coast, many of us voluntarily got up earlier in the morning than we had to in order to go to French language classes in HMCS Naden, the shore base. On board the Fraser, the supply officer and myself thought we'd like to improve our French, so we recruited the 2 French-Canadian sub-lieutenants on board to give us some help. Both of these junior officers were graduates of both College Militaire Royal de Saint-Jean and Royal Military College, Kingston. One evening, as the 4 of us sat talking following our French lesson, and in a moment of well-intentioned enthusiasm, I said this: "What disturbs me most of all about official bilingualism is living in a country with 2 divided language groups. I think I would prefer to live in a country with one language, even if that language should happen to be French." One of the 2 sub-lieutenants, the friendlier of the 2, looked at the other and said, "Shall we tell them?" The other shook his head and put his finger to his lips. That was the end of the conversation, but it was just the beginning of my thinking. The second incident occurred as I was writing my book Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow in the winter of 1974-75. I had returned to Ottawa in 1966 and served there with the Navy until I retired in 1974, witnessing for 8 years the unbelievable moves toward Frenchification of the Canadian forces and the federal public services that were being made by Trudeau. On a visit to my hometown in Northern Ontario in September 1974, I witnessed a huge rally of French Canadians at the local arena. A few weeks later, I saw the same thing again in Nova Scotia. In both cases, the doors were guarded to make sure that only French Canadians entered. While writing the book, I became acquainted with a retired, very senior French Canadian civil servant. This gentleman had held jobs in Ottawa and Quebec that absolutely guaranteed that he knew what was going on in the inner circles of the Trudeau regime. In one discussion we had about what was being done in Canada, I told him of what I had seen and that I had a pretty good idea that the Trudeau government was providing agitators to incite French Canadians across Canada to hatred for English-speaking Canada with the ultimate goal of a French-Canadian takeover. Our discussion became more and more heated, and I told him that I was damned if I had served for 28 years in Canada's Navy just to see the country taken over by a bunch of fanatics. I asked him how these people were organized, and in an unguarded moment he said, "Yes, it's true. They are working out of the offices of Health and Welfare run by Marc Lalonde." But then he went on to add something equally disturbing, perhaps thinking it might make me feel better. He said, "You know, our real enemies aren't so much the English as the Jews. They have been exploiting French Canada from the beginning." The next day, when I saw my friend again, he was visibly frightened, and he said, "Forget I ever said what I said. Forget you ever met me. It's secret." I promised him then that I wouldn't reveal his name. But I can assure you that the positions this man has held in the Canadian government were very senior ones. The third such incident happened in Quebec City in the presence of Mr. Kim Abbott. This incident also illustrates why the Trudeau and Mulroney governments have spent over $3 billion since 1968 to provide French immersion schooling for English-speaking school children across Canada. Mr. Abbott, who was at different times an official of the Ontario and federal governments, was attending an interprovincial meeting in Quebec City, and the lunch break was held at a restaurant overlooking the Plains of Abraham. Mr. Abbott had made a casual remark about it being unbelievable that such a battle could have taken place in such a beautiful setting. Mr. Abbott's host, a senior Quebec official, became very serious and said, "You won the battle, Mr. Abbott, but you lost the war. Your mistake was to give us our language and our religion. I can assure you that when we have power, we will not make that mistake." The fourth and last of these incidents occurred in the spring of 1978, a year after Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow was published. My wife and I were in Spain. Among our friends there is a French-Canadian lady whom I have known and liked since 1950. She has lived in Spain since 1964, but has kept up a friendship with one of Trudeau's lieutenants, who was promoted from the cabinet to the Senate for unethical conduct that unfortunately for him came to public attention. One day, as she and I were driving home from our choral group, she asked me, "Why did you write such a book?" I replied that French Canada has decided that they want the whole of Canada, and I happen to disagree with them. She smiled and said, "No, we only want the government." She was being fairly honest. French Canada only wants the government, the federal government, each of the 10 provincial governments, each county government, and each municipal government across the whole of Canada. Which brings us to the purpose of this book. The score today is as follows. There are 7 points here. First, the federal government of Canada and everything it entails is now under French-Canadian control. Second, the government of Quebec is now under total French-Canadian control, and English-speaking Canadians in Quebec have no language or political rights whatsoever except the right to vote. Even if they are French-speaking, they cannot get jobs with either the federal government in Quebec or with the Quebec government, simply because French Canadians only is Quebec and federal government unwritten policy. Third, the government of New Brunswick is now officially bilingual, and bilingual jobs in New Brunswick, which means virtually all jobs there, now go exclusively to French Canadians. Fourth, the government of Prince Edward Island has now approved the provision of full French language services throughout the province to accommodate a number of Francophones moved into Charlottetown with the Department of Veterans Affairs by the Trudeau government. That legislation spells the beginning of the end for English-speaking Canadians in PEI as Quebecers flood in to provide those French language services. Fifth, the same applies to Manitoba. The Manitoba government and the City of Quebec are in transition to French-Canadian control. Sixth, on the 18th of November 1986, the Ontario government, in the most frightening piece of legislation I have ever read in my life, approved Bill 8 for the provision of complete French language services for areas in Ontario that encompass 93% of the population of that province. Bill 8, in its implementation and instructions, now overrides every other piece of legislation and consideration of the Ontario government from this time onward. I will deal with that unbelievable piece of legislation in detail in the next chapter. And what I will show is this. From the moment that Bill 8 was passed, the government of Ontario became the instrument by which the English language is to be eliminated from the province of Ontario. All this to accommodate a minority of less than 5% French Canadians, most of whom speak English as well as I do. The legislation to make Ontario officially bilingual has also already been drafted by the Ontario government. Seventh, for British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia, with French-Canadian populations of 1 and 2%, the writing is on the wall. The same legislation that has now been passed in Manitoba, PEI, New Brunswick, and Ontario has already been drafted and is in the hands of your provincial Francophone associations. Not only has the legislation been drafted, but the designation of those jobs within and without your individual provincial governments that will initially be made bilingual and thus go to French Canadians has probably already been made. In the end, as we are seeing in the federal government, all jobs will be French-speaking, and all jobs will go to French Canadians as soon as the Anglos can be phased out. If the French-Canadian colonization of Canada's 9 English-speaking provinces and 3 territories that began with the federal government under Trudeau is now becoming apparent, it will seem a trickle compared to the flow of Francophones from Quebec that will be needed to satisfy the requirements of this new and totally predictable provincial legislation in each of our provinces. But that is only the beginning of the end for English-speaking Canada. What about the real beginning of all this nonsense? Are you aware that there was only one piece of legislation ever passed by Canada's Parliament for what has been done to this country? That legislation was the Official Languages Act. But at the same time, there were tens of thousands of secret orders in council and secret cabinet directives that were and remain completely unknown to our unthinking, uncaring, totally party-faithful members of Parliament. Those secret directives, all of them intended for the total Frenchification of Canada, have resulted in the expenditure of scores of billions of dollars and the bankrupting of this country. They have resulted in our being the highest taxed nation in the world so that we could pay for our own subjugation and ultimate extinction. The latest addition to this tax horror is the business transfer tax, or what the British call the value-added tax. With every dollar we earn and with every dollar we spend, we are paying the salaries of thousands of French-Canadian politicians and public servants whose sole purpose and whose sole job is to bring an early end to English-speaking Canada. And now Ottawa wants a federal sales tax to help meet the cost. Those same secret directives have resulted in an immigration policy that virtually precludes any English-speaking person from entering Canada from the United States, England, Ireland, Scotland, Australia, and New Zealand, while at the same time Canada's doors have been opened wide to virtually anyone else, and Quebec is allowed to let anyone it wants into Canada. Are you aware that through these secret cabinet directives there are units of Canada's armed forces that are organized and trained for the sole purpose of subduing any signs of civil or political unrest in English-speaking Canada? Are you aware that through these secret cabinet directives provisions exist for emptying Canada's jails to accommodate dissident English-speaking Canadians in case English-speaking Canada wakes up? Do you wonder why such an effort has been made to convert the RCMP to French-speaking control when the province of Quebec doesn't even use the RCMP? Are you aware that French-Canadian mounted policemen have been planted in every city and town in English-speaking Canada to spy and report on English-speaking Canadians who may not agree with the total Frenchification of this country? Are you aware that Trudeau created a secret service for the express purpose of spying on people such as myself who have chosen to think for themselves? On November 19, 1987, I spoke in Toronto before the Alliance for the Preservation of English in Canada, which I fully endorse. The English-speaking media paid not one whit of attention, but the French CBC were there with their camera crews. Because the meeting was billed as an open one, they couldn't very well be asked to leave. They videotaped every minute of that meeting from 8 p.m. until 11 p.m. They took close-ups of every single person at that meeting, where, incidentally, someone suggested I should get a bodyguard. I'm sure that a copy of every inch of that videotape was passed to our Trudeau-created secret police within hours. At the same meeting, I indicated clearly that I intended to write this book. I am equally sure that every effort will be made to see that it is not published, and if it is published, efforts will be made to see that it cannot be sold. Shortly after that APEC meeting, the sedition arm of the secret police was reported to have been discontinued because of overzealousness. In 1966, before he became Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, speaking to the American Society of Newspaper Editors, said this: There is no way two ethnic groups in one country can be made equal before the law, and to say it is possible is to sow the seeds of destruction. For Canadians, that statement should descend like a bolt of lightning. It shows that Trudeau never had the least intention of making French Canadians and English-speaking Canadians equal before the law. For 20 years now, we English-speaking Canadians have been led to our own subjugation and ultimate extinction by a handful of lying conspirators, by a minority that has been counseled to race hatred by our own elected government, and by our own gullible members of Parliament whose only apparent concern is their re-election and their pensions. Chapter 2. Ontario's Bill 8, the French Language Services Act. Before we get into this horrifying piece of legislation that became law in Ontario on November 18, 1986, and will soon be law in our remaining English-speaking provinces, I want to try to show you how this unbelievable piece of legislation came about. Many of you will remember the book Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, which was published in March 1977. That book sold 120,000 copies, even though Trudeau French Canada and much of the government-subsidized media did everything in their power to stop the book being distributed and to ridicule both the book and myself. Extracts from that book, which were printed on the book's back cover by the publisher, said this: Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow pursues the implementation of Canada's Official Languages Act to its logical conclusion, the colonization of Canada's 9 English-speaking provinces, and of the national capital by French-speaking Canadians. The primary and sole objective since Mr. Trudeau came to power has been to convert Canada to a French-speaking nation. That objective will remain until every city, town, and village in Canada has become French-speaking and French-controlled. That strategy is based on one fact. Many French Canadians can speak English, but very few English-speaking Canadians can speak French. The way is obvious. Simply make each and every government job available only to those who can speak both languages. Since Mr. Trudeau came to power, the federal government has been sending agitators, paid by the Secretary of State's Department, into every community outside Quebec in which there are any French Canadians at all, regardless of how few. The purpose is to have the French Canadian element demand that every service which is provided by the provincial, county, and municipal governments be provided in the French language. They are told to demand that all policemen, bus drivers, telephone operators, hospital workers, provincial and municipal government workers be French-speaking. They are organized into pressure groups to demand that stores, banks, and business owners hire only French-speaking clerks, personnel managers, and managers. One at a time, the provinces are crumbling. Perhaps the most important thing I said about the Frenchification of our provinces in that first book was that a tremendous amount of monetary and political pressure was being brought to bear on the provincial governments and on the individual provincial politicians by all the money and resources available to the federal cabinet. Day-to-day pressure was also brought to bear by the federally funded French-Canadian lobby groups in the provincial capitals and by the highly organized militant French-Canadian associations demanding their rights at the offices of individual MPPs. As a result, the provincial premiers, whose only real concern at any time is their own political survival, referred to all these demands for French services and for official bilingualism to committees. These committees, quite naturally, were manned for the most part by French Canadians and for the remainder by others who were hand-picked for their sympathy to the cause. Since the findings of these well-financed committees were, again quite naturally, totally in favor of full French language services and official bilingualism, the provincial premiers, with New Brunswick and Manitoba and PEI and Ontario leading the parade, have taken the political way out. Concede to pressure, don't make waves, don't become known as bigots, don't under any circumstances ask the 95%, 98%, and 99% English-speaking majorities of your provinces if they have any views on what they may want for their future and the future of their children. If a considerable number of you remember my first book, there won't be many of you who have heard of my second, and there's a good reason for it. That book was called Backdoor Bilingualism. It was published in 1980, just in time to see Trudeau restored to power after being defeated by his lackey, Joe Clark. Lest anyone have any doubts about the position of Joe Clark vis-à-vis the Frenchification of Canada, I want to quote a short blurb from the back cover of that second book. Up to 1978, the Canadian government paid out over $600 million for the Frenchification of our English-speaking provinces. By 1983, Ottawa plans to pay out a further $850 million. Over $5 million has already gone to the Ontario Francophone Association alone to agitate for services in French. $75 million more will be paid to Francophone associations across Canada for the same purpose. Those figures do not include the funding by Quebec. On July 5, 1977, in the House of Commons, Joe Clark stated, "The programs so far introduced by the federal government for the policy of institutional bilingualism, essential as it is, are hopelessly inadequate given the size of the task." The book described in detail the way the provincial governments were being taken over by their minuscule French-Canadian minorities. It cited in detail the amounts in hundreds of millions of dollars that has gone from Ottawa to each of the provincial French-Canadian associations for the purpose of bringing pressure to bear for the attainment of French language services and official bilingualism in each of our English-speaking provinces. From documents smuggled out of the Ontario government, the book showed how Ontario Premier Davis had folded totally to Francophone demands and how he had been doing so for the previous 10 years to the immediate and ultimate cost of Ontario's taxpayers and job holders. That same book told what English Canada's response was to Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, and how and why that response eventually came to very little. English Canada's response, incidentally, was phenomenal. God willing, we may see it again now, today, with everyone finally convinced of what is being done to this country. And now, with the means of uniting ourselves for a common purpose, which I shall describe later, hopefully we shall be able to bring this hostile invasion to a halt and an absolute and final reversal. The first printing of Backdoor Bilingualism was stored in a large machine shop in North Toronto. Within weeks, the machine shop burned to the ground. Not a copy of the book remained. The book was then reprinted and about 10,000 copies were sold. But to my knowledge, Backdoor Bilingualism was never mentioned in the whole of the Canadian media except for one review in the Toronto Sun. I wondered about the reason for this disturbing silence until I read of a meeting held by Pierre Trudeau for Canadian newspaper publishers in Montreal at about that time. At that meeting, Trudeau told our publishers, "If you don't publish as I direct, I will do it for you." From that point on, I had a pretty good idea of what had happened to Backdoor Bilingualism. For anyone who believes that the transition of the Ontario government from English to French began with Bill 8 in 1986, I can only refer you to the earlier book, Backdoor Bilingualism, to show you that Ontario's government was already in transition to meet the French-Canadian Association's demands by the mid-1970s. The evidence even then was too voluminous to reproduce here, and in view of what has occurred since, is now irrelevant. What I do want to show you here is a list of a number of the needs and aspirations expressed by the associations of French Canadians of Ontario at various seminars that were conducted, complete with cocktail parties, by the Ontario government across Ontario in 1979. These were the services that the Ontario government was expected to provide and now indeed will provide in their entirety. These, then, are the needs and aspirations of our provincial French-Canadian minorities. Welcome services for newly arrived French-speaking persons, French language instructions for partners of mixed marriages. Young Franco-Ontarians in Southern Ontario need sports, culture, and social activities conducted in the French language. Schools where Franco-Ontarian students must speak French only in classes, in the gymnasium, in the cafeteria, on the playing field, and in all extracurricular activities. Franco-Ontarians want to be accepted as a permanent part of the population of Ontario and not as an ethnic group which will be completely assimilated in 2 generations. Franco-Ontarians want government services provided in the French language by civil servants who understand both their language and their culture. Franco-Ontarians want French language services in education, especially on school boards, libraries, cultural centers, health, justice, and the media, newspapers, radio, and television. The socioeconomic level of Franco-Ontarians in the eastern counties is lower than that of the Anglophones because they hold fewer important positions in relation to their English-speaking counterparts. The federal government's French language services program is much more favorably received than the provincial government programs. At the municipal level, the quality of services varies widely. The aspirations of Franco-Ontarians are focused particularly on services provided by the Ministries of Health, Justice, Education, Culture, and Recreation. Equally prominent is the aspiration for legal recognition of the right to services in the French language. French language services should be adaptations rather than literal translations of services provided in English. Franco-Ontarians need made-to-measure government services. With respect to the sequence of offer and demand in the matter of French language services, the services should be offered first in order to literally create demand instead of waiting to provide services only after repeated requests for services. The ministries of Queen's Park should exercise leadership in providing French language services as required through close contacts with their regional offices. It should be made clear to the personnel of regional offices in the designated areas that the providing of French language services is important. Translation services provided by Queen's Park are not fast enough. Regional translation facilities should be established in northern and possibly southwestern areas of the province. Ministry and government agencies should use a bilingual telephone greeting. Express demand for service in French is not a good indicator of actual need. A manual of bilingual signage should be developed and made available. A lack of resources for producing French language press releases is a serious problem. Better publicity and improved distribution channels should be developed to serve the French language public. Few hospitals seem to address themselves to a proper level of French language services. Those who have had French language training are not given opportunities to use it. The program of developing bilingual office signs is too slow in developing. The changeover to French courts with French judges and lawyers is not moving fast enough. A preference for civil servants of Franco-Ontarian background is suggested to serve the French-speaking population. A delay of 15 or 20 minutes to obtain service in French is unreasonable and an undue imposition. If you put all these needs and aspirations and demands together, you will come up with this. In the briefest of terms, the French-Canadian associations of each of our provinces may want any French Canadian in every province to be able to walk into any provincial government office, or a municipal government office, or public utility office, or a license bureau, or police station, or library, or hospital, or prison, or museum, or art gallery, or gas station, or liquor store, or mental institution, or old age home, or fire department, or bus station, or train station, or store, or business, or restaurant, or law court, or law office, or school, or college, or university, or airport, or ferry terminal, or doctor's office, and addressing themselves in French to whomever they choose, they want to be replied to then and there not only in French, but by a fellow French Canadian. When you consider that those rights are now firmly in place in Quebec, New Brunswick, and Ottawa, these demands on the remaining provinces aren't really too much to expect. What's even funnier is that French Canadians are going to get these rights because Manitoba and PEI, and now Ontario, with its iniquitous Bill 8, have now approved those rights. If you think of these French-Canadian rights in terms of their effect on the more than 96% of us who make up the non-Francophone population of 9 of our 10 provinces, French-Canadian rights don't leave many rights for the rest of us. Look closely at the spectrum of jobs involved. There are remarkably few jobs left, except in the remote corners of our factories, for our Italian, Portuguese, West Indian, East Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Egyptian, German, Dutch, Scandinavian, Ukrainian, Polish, Spanish, and other English-speaking Canadians, including those of Irish, Scotch, and English descent. So much for the Trudeau fable of multiculturalism. Like Canadian unity and bilingualism, it had its purpose. All three were invented to appeal to our generous instincts and blind us all while this country has been whipped from under our feet like a rug on a marble floor. Multiculturalism serves only one purpose, which is to divide up and control the non-French Canadian population of Canada. In the next few years, we are going to see more and more use of multiculturalism and minority rights by Ottawa to paralyze the whole of Canada, while French Canada moves in to take charge of every last city, town, and village. As usual, you are paying for it. And meanwhile, the immigrant population, delighted by the money and attention they are getting from Canada's government, are being sucked right along. They, like the rest of us, have been suckered and swindled from the beginning. In the summer of 1977, shortly after Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow was published, I was on a radio talk show one morning with John Michael of CJRN Niagara Falls. Because of the interest of the subject, the telephone lines were jammed during the 3-hour program. Most of the callers were strongly in favor of doing away with bilingualism and in favor of Quebec going its own way. I remember one very nice-sounding young girl telling us that she had worked in a local restaurant. One day, a French-speaking family came into the restaurant, and the father started to give their orders in French. The girl said to the father, "I'm very sorry, but I don't speak French." The father replied, "You're going to have to learn it anyway, so you might as well get used to it." He then proceeded once more to order in French. Once again the girl apologized and said she was really sorry, but she just didn't speak French. Once again the man ignored her plea and proceeded with his order in French. The girl told us that she just couldn't help breaking into tears at this treatment. But she won't have to worry in the future, because under Ontario's Bill 8, she won't be able to get a job in a restaurant in Niagara Falls or Metropolitan Toronto or Hamilton or Mississauga or Windsor or Ottawa or in the whole of Northern and Eastern Ontario. And probably by the time this book gets published, she won't be able to get a job for the same reason in Kitchener and London or in any other part of Ontario. Those areas which are now called designated areas are ones in which the Francophone associations purport to have been able to put together nose counts of 5,000 nominally French Canadians. In the case of Metropolitan Toronto, the official nose count from the 1981 census of those who speak French at home is 0.2% to 1% of the population, and most of that minuscule minority was moved to Toronto by Trudeau to fill federal government jobs. Almost the same ratios and the same reason applies to the Hamilton area, the Mississauga area, and other cities throughout Ontario, except Ottawa, where the Trudeau-created invasion has been enormous. But that's enough preamble. What then does Ontario's French Language Services Act say? Here is the substance, and most of it is in direct quotes. 1. The Government of Ontario shall ensure that services are provided in French in accordance with this Act. 2. All bills introduced to the Legislative Assembly after January 1, 1991 shall be introduced and enacted in both French and English. 3. Everyone has the right to use French or English in the debates and other proceedings of the Legislative Assembly. 4. Before December 31, 1991, all Ontario laws shall be translated into French. 5. Beginning November 18, 1986, a person has the right to communicate in French with and to receive services in French from any designated head office or central office of any Ontario government agency or institution. The same right applies immediately to all other offices of agencies and institutions that serve areas designated by the law. Such designated areas already encompass 93% of the Ontario population, as I have shown. The function of the Ontario government's huge public service is no longer to provide a service for Ontario's people. Instead, the Ontario government and its entire public service has become a huge machine which, on the pretext of providing a service for Ontario's 4.6% fully bilingual francophones, is in fact in the full-time business of converting itself and every other entity in Ontario, both public and private, into recruiting centres and sinecures for hundreds of thousands of French Canadians. And since there aren't a fraction enough French Canadians in Ontario to fill all these francophone jobs that are being artificially created, recruiting must go, and indeed has long been going, to Quebec. With Ontario's French Language Services Act, we have seen Ontario's Premier Peterson bring into effect not only the death sentence of English-speaking Ontario, but the invitation to an invasion of this province by French Canadians from Quebec who will be arriving to fill jobs that can no longer be legally filled in this 95% English-speaking province by English-speaking Canadians. Meanwhile, to guarantee that death sentence of English-speaking Canada, immigration to Canada has been increased again this year. I have just one last point to make on Ontario's Bill 8, a point that makes me wonder whether I have lost my grip on reality. Did you know that when Bill 8 passed the Ontario legislature, there was not one dissenting vote? Of 125 MPs, 55 were present and 70 absented themselves, presumably to show their disfavor. Whatever their reason, they just weren't there. Not only was there no dissenting vote, but indeed there was no recorded vote at all. When Canadians in our 4 western provinces say that they despise Ontario's government, believe me when I say I agree with them. But in this case, one or more of 3 things is wrong. Either our Ontario provincial politicians don't know what's going on in this country, which is quite possible, or they have been bought, which is equally possible, and if they have been bought, it's with money that you paid in federal taxes, or there is something drastically wrong with our system of party politics. Whatever the excuse or excuses, taking into account what the Ontario French Language Services Act is going to do to Ontario and Canada, by creating a totally francophone-controlled Central Canadian core consisting of the 15 million people who comprise Ontario and Quebec in the very heart of Canada's remaining and dispersed 10 million, I find it unbelievable that not one man or woman had the courage to stand up in the Ontario legislature and say, "This is wrong for Ontario and it's wrong for Canada." Since Trudeau came to power in 1968, the primary function of the federal government has been to bring about the Frenchification of English-speaking Canada. This remains and will remain the goal of the federal government simply because Quebec has convinced the rest of Canada that all of Canada's future prime ministers must not only be French-speaking but totally sympathetic to the goals of French Canada. With the enactment of the French Language Services Act in Ontario and similar legislation in Manitoba, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, the principal function of the governments of those provinces has become the unrestricted Frenchification of those provinces. It is just a matter of time before we see the same state of affairs in Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. The legislation for such action has already been drafted by the provincial francophone associations with the assistance and financing of the Federal Secretary of State. The legislation to make Ontario an officially bilingual province has already been drafted by the Ontario government. Canada's present immigration policy, created by Trudeau and still in place, was designed expressly to both outnumber and politically nullify those of us who are of English, Irish, Scottish, American, German, Dutch, Italian, Scandinavian, and Slavic descent in this country. The Frenchification of our Canadian government and all its entities was carried out in Trudeau's first years in office by doubling the numbers in the public service and recruiting almost exclusively in Quebec. The policy has continued by replacing English-speaking retirees with recruits from Quebec. Today, in Ottawa, if you don't speak French, you are dead-ended in your job and removed from public contact. This Trudeau policy is being rigorously enforced under Mulroney. Quebec has become an impregnable French-Canadian fortress in which English-speaking Canadians have no rights except the right to vote. As I shall show later, it was Trudeau, as Canada's Minister of Justice, who suggested to Quebec that they outlaw the English language. In Ontario, New Brunswick, and Manitoba, those villages, towns, and cities which have been taken over by their francophone majorities have become extremely hazardous places to live for their remaining English-speaking Canadians. They go without jobs and they keep silent, or they get their tires slashed or worse. Appeals against discrimination are laughed at by an unsympathetic commissioner for official languages. The government-financed colonization of our English-speaking cities, combined with an immigration policy calculated to swamp English-speaking Canada, has resulted in runaway inflation in the real estate market. The worst example is Toronto, where most people now simply cannot afford to live. Through careful propaganda abroad, Canada has come to be recognized by most nations, the U.S. included, as a French-speaking nation. For all of the above, what has English-speaking Canada gained? The answer is that we have gained absolutely nothing. We have completely lost our rights as full citizens of Canada. We can no longer be employed by our federal government, our armed forces, our central police force, any federal government corporation, agency, board, or other entity, unless we agree to the farcical and artificial requirement of learning a second language, the sole purpose of which is to bring about the further Frenchification of the whole of Canada and the domination, subjugation, and elimination of English-speaking Canada and English-speaking Canadians. We have now completely lost our rights as full citizens of half our provinces and will soon have lost the same rights in the remaining provinces for exactly the same reasons that I have enumerated above. We have seen our tax money thrown away like water for 20 years and our country bankrupted for the express purpose of bringing about our own extermination. In short, we have lost our rights to be English-speaking people in an English-speaking country simply because we and our vast majority of English-speaking politicians in Ottawa and across Canada have been trusting, gullible, gutless, and completely conned by a bunch of determined bandits. Therefore, we have two choices. We can either continue to do nothing and watch English-speaking Canada continue to be swallowed up by this nightmare, or we can try our best to bring this invasion to a total halt and a complete reversal. I vote for the second choice, and I am prepared to stand up anywhere in Canada and say so. There is no room for compromise. If Quebec wants to be French, and it certainly intends to be, that is Quebec's problem. But there is no reason on earth why the rest of Canada should continue to bear the cost of carrying this xenophobic province whose sole goal is English Canada's extinction. The sooner we get rid of Quebec and stop paying for its legions of imperialistic colonists throughout the rest of the country, the sooner we will return to sanity. Quebec encompasses 3 times the area of France with 1/9 of France's population. It has 10 times the natural resources of France, none of which are now shared with the rest of Canada, but all of which development is paid for and subsidized by the rest of Canada. There is ample room and ample opportunity in Quebec for every French Canadian who wants to be French and for anyone else with the same inclination. There is absolutely no reason for retaining the artificially created redundancy of the French language either in our national capital or in our 9 predominantly English-speaking provinces and 3 territories. We don't need French to work or to live, and we most certainly don't need the presence of the French fact in either Ottawa or our 9 provinces to tell us how we are going to live and be governed and pay taxes and work and not work, as the case may be. There is absolutely no need for French language services or official bilingualism or French immersion schooling or exclusive French schools for French Canadians or translation services or bilingual publishing or labeling or French language radio or television anywhere in English-speaking Canada. If we feel compelled to learn a 2nd or 3rd or 4th language, let those languages be ones that do us and Canada some good, such as Russian or Japanese or Chinese or Spanish or Portuguese. If an independent Quebec wants to do business with English-speaking Canada, then let that business be conducted in the English language, just as it is with the United States. Why should we pay for an army of French-Canadian translators and secretaries and advertisers and business managers at horrendous cost? If Quebec chooses not to do business on our terms, then let it sink. If those French Canadians who are transported from Quebec to colonize English-speaking Canada at public expense wish to stay and compete with us for jobs in terms of skills and effort and integrity, and in one language, the English language, then let them stay. But if they want to be French, then they can move to Quebec at their own expense. If we need Canadian armed forces, then let those armed forces be English-speaking, and let their sworn allegiance be to English-speaking Canada and not to the takeover of this country by French Canada. It is time for a new political party on both the national scene and in each of our provinces. But new political parties don't just begin on their own. How then can we begin? First, we should state our goals, which I believe should be the following: to restore Canada to the status of a unified, unilingual, English-speaking nation, to restore the government of Canada and all its entities to the exclusive use of the English language, to invite and, if necessary, enforce the departure of the state of Quebec from the new Canada, to restore the status of each of our 9 predominantly English-speaking provinces and 3 territories to the status of unilingual English-speaking provinces and territories, to eliminate French immersion schooling, to eliminate French-only schooling, to audit all government laws, both federal, provincial, and municipal, and to repeal all those laws that are concerned with the provision of any French language services, to audit all government expenditures, both federal and provincial, and cancel all expenditures which are concerned with the provision of any French language services, to eliminate all government laws, services, and expenditures which were designed with the purpose of dividing this nation in terms of racial or ethnic backgrounds, to audit and make public all secret orders in council and secret cabinet directives from 1968 onward. At both the federal and provincial levels, to establish tribunals to examine Senate, parliamentary, cabinet, and other government records in cases where it can be shown that elected representatives, appointees, or public servants have been expressly motivated toward the overthrow or elimination of English-speaking Canada, or to the intimidation or abuse of English-speaking public servants. The tribunal will make recommendation to the cabinet for the dismissal of such individuals. To establish a second tribunal for the restoration of job or pension rights for individuals who have been intimidated, abused, or deprived of rights by the Frenchification process we have witnessed since 1968. To eliminate all French radio and television services throughout English-speaking Canada. To review and revise Canada's immigration policy to reflect the wishes of the Canadian people. to write a new constitution with the cooperation of our 9 provinces, embodying English as the single official language of our various governments at all levels, and of business and industry and daily life in Canada. This does not preclude the use of any other language. Today, you and I still have a choice of what we want this country to be. From now, what happens to this country is up to all of us together.